Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to Ezek Hydra. Within this video, we're going to be doing a thorough talkthrough of Warhammer Chaosbane, the latest ARPG set in Warhammer Fantasy, made for the PC as well as Xbox, PlayStation, you name it. Now, this game, like all Games Workshop products, is having mixed reviews, and hopefully this video is going to be helpful for you guys that are slightly on the fence, or maybe just wanting to consolidate your own views, or maybe just have a little bit of a rant. The purpose of this video is to help you make a choice, and hopefully I will do a good job of that. If you disagree though, or if you have your own points you want to throw in, do stick them down in the comments below. Now, to get things started, rather than go through the visuals, I'm going to be showing plenty of gameplay in the background here, so I don't really feel I need to tell you how I feel the game looks. You can see that for yourselves. What I'm going to talk about is how the game plays. To start off with, I think it's good to talk about the early character journey which you'll make. After the initial intro blurb, which more or less sets the scene and does enough to give you something to do, oh look, there's someone being attacked over there, let's go and help out, and here's a bit of backstory as to who you are. It's a sufficient introduction, I find. It's adequate in order to thrust you into a game, and straight away you're put in the traditional setting of having a left click button and a couple of basic enemies to take down. You'll notice straight away the pace of the game is perhaps a little bit slow for the earlier levels, with one or two rooms being cleared before you unlock a new ability. They come fairly fast, but within maybe the first hour and a half to 2 hours you're going to be basically filling out your taskbar. And this is where one thing needs to be mentioned, and this helps sort of highlight what this game is. Rather than giving you A-B choices of what you'd like to unlock, like something like Path of Exile, you basically unlock abilities in a linear fashion, much more like something like Diablo 3. Because it takes a little while to unlock them, the first 2 hours of this game are probably not going to be spent with you making any choices about your build. It's simply going to be, here's what you're going to get, go and smack people with it. And I think this is a good note to jump on straight away, because it does kind of sell you the vibe as to where the priorities of this game lies. This game is clearly pitching itself towards a more accessible, semi-choice based. You do have character customization, you do have enough abilities in the end, but it's certainly not going in the direction of appealing to the heavy customization sort of style ARPG. Much more pick up and play, couch co-op focused, maybe not couch co-op focused, but multiplayer focused, accessible entry-level ARPG. And as we work through the game and unlock these abilities, during the first 10 missions, you will be treated to a gradually expanding list of enemies, which basically starts off as your Nurglings. You work towards your basic sort of Nurgle followers and cultists, then you'll get plague bearers with flags or standards. And what you'll notice here is that this is one thing the developers seem to have done quite well, is they've included an array of abilities and attack animations which not only hurt when you are hit, but also need to be avoided or dealt with in some way. Now, this isn't the same as a combat of, say, PoE D3, where enemies have random abilities. Instead, within this game, the enemies have fixed abilities. So if you see a Nurgle Plague Bearer with a standard, you know he's going to be healing nearby units. He's not going to throw any surprises your way. There are variables to add random things to the maps for the end of the game, but as you work your way through, you'll be meeting new enemies, and in each chapter there will be a different Chaos faction to follow, but it will be fairly predictable once you're familiar with the enemies. But fortunately, each mission tends to bring a new enemy to the equation, making things slightly more complex. It is worth pointing out, though, that as you move through the game, the enemy complexity does feel like it's recycled a fair bit. Although each of the factions has unique things going for it, you will see similar models and a fair bit of overlap with animations. And obviously, I feel that this is just to be expected, but it is certainly something that you will pick up on. As with the visuals per se of the maps, there will be a little bit of an air of repetitiveness. Even though the actual game is not particularly long, there will be a little bit of a repetitive vibe as you're going along in terms of enemies, maps and locations. But fortunately, as you're playing through these areas, you will get access to a decent array of abilities, and eventually after the first couple of hours you will be able to work your way into building your first build. And in terms of the abilities available to each class, I feel like there's a decent choice available to them. You have basically a mixture of mobility, utility, buff and damage, and most of these combine two of those categories together. So every character feels like it's got some mobility, it's got some damage and utility, and you normally end up feeling like you've got some sort of hybrid build while leveling. Every button does something, and you're rarely walking around pressing one button, although there certainly are some builds which will lend themselves to this. But I would say, all in all, everything adding up so far, we're leaning towards a pretty decent hack and slash experience at the very least, with combat seeming fairly fluid, fairly well polished, and the visuals being quite pleasing. One thing we'll also note as you collect these abilities is quite a few of the flashy animations aren't necessarily right at the end game like something like PoE, but they're brought a lot sooner, so your visuals are looking fairly impressive, right, I'd say past the range of 15 or so. There'll be lots of flashy, pretty cool looking things on the screen, and you can really see once you've got 4 players on there, lots of impressive visuals going on, and in terms of optimization, the game seems to cope very well with this, although that being said, I'm running a 1080 Ti, so I can't speak on behalf of everyone's system. But on this note, we have to talk about the actual game systems that will be playing this and the lack of graphical options. You can change resolution and you can choose VSync and a bunch of in-game visual options, but there's basically not a standard array of anti-aliasing and sort of textures. There's not the standard stuff we'd expect, so I don't know how this will run on low-end systems, and that's certainly something to factor in if you are buying this. You may not be able to, let's say, tailor the graphical options to what you have. Now, as you move through the campaign, you will get to your first boss, and for me, this really summarises one of the things that the game has perhaps even focused on, where the combat itself is decent and quite well polished, I feel. The bosses themselves clearly are the pinnacle of what the gameplay offers, at least as far as I'm concerned. I would describe it as something like a multi-phase raid-style boss encounter, and certainly the first few engagements while you're figuring out the mechanics are a beautiful thing to behold. Every boss is quite unique, although they do fit into some of the tropes of bosses you will have seen in other games. Papa Nurgle, for example, will sit in his chair and cast abilities, you may need to block line of sight, etc. We'll be doing boss guides, don't worry. These will feel fairly familiar, especially if you've done enough boss battles during your life, and if you've raided in MMOs, quite a few of these ideas have probably been borrowed from elsewhere. But overall, I would say the boss battles are a real highlight, and if the difficulty is cranked up, trying to achieve them with a party is a huge amount of fun and a real pleasure. But once you've gone through all of this, if we fast forward about 6 or 7 hours, you start finding your way toward the end of the game. If you've upped the difficulty and decided to go for a higher challenge, you could probably eke it out to 15 to 20 hours if you're really going for a challenge, but playing it at like a basic level difficulty, or if you've got a particularly strong build, you are likely going to complete the campaign portion of the game, within the region of 6 to 8 hours. Now, this is something where we have to comment on the difficulty first, and then we'll come back to the length of the game. The difficulty itself, and this is for me is a big issue, does not increase the amount of XP you get. So, whereas we have games like D3, where you more or less have to increase the difficulty in order to get a sufficient amount of XP to continue leveling, in this game you don't. However, playing the game through very hard, from the beginning to the end, does continually feel that level of difficulty, with the exception of Act 3 that has a very weird difficulty spike in it for no apparent reason. But the game doesn't necessarily demand you increase the difficulty unless you come out with some janky build. So it's a very different system to D3. However, there is no inherent reward for increasing the difficulty, so playing the game through on normal or even easy, you will level up just as fast. Well, obviously you will level up faster because it's going to be a lot quicker to race through the content. For me, this is a little bit of an issue. There's no real incentive to play harder difficulties other than getting slightly better gear. And before we go back to that point about the game being a little bit on the short side, we need to talk about gear, because gears are very important to an ARPG. During the leveling process, you'll get access to uncommon, or you get the basically trash, and then you'll get blue, and then you'll get yellow, which is the rare tier. And each of these will come with an array of stats that will be familiar to an ARPG player, but the pool of potential let's say, stats available, it's going to be about 50% of what you'd probably expect. There's no elemental resistances, etc. There's no life on hit or things like that. A lot of the extra fluff has been done away with in place of just the basics: crit hit, crit damage, and energy levels, armor, things of that nature. There is enough in order to create somewhat interesting builds, at least, but it's certainly less complex and less crunchy than a lot of other games. But the result of this means that more or less every time you pick up a weapon, you're just simply hovering over the offense and defense sort of highlight or summary to see, is this green? Okay, I'll click on it. So this means the gearing process while leveling through the early portion of the game is largely very uneventful, with the skin variety being of around 3 to 4 skins, I believe, during the leveling process, and it's okay. It does feel visually fairly repetitive, as sort of fitting with the rest of the game. More skins are available later, as are the final tier of item. And for me this was a little bit of an issue, because as you're leveling through most ARPGs, there'll be moments where you find an item and it's very exciting. You get an amazing sound effect as it drops on the floor in front of you. There's amazing looking colour beaming up to the sky, and you pick it up and holy cow, this is amazing, I can't wait to go bash stuff with it. You have to wait for this moment till the end of the game, and certainly the weapons at the end of the game are very good. You have around 3 sets of armour for each character, and a couple of weapons, and a couple of ring choices, and a couple of amulets, etc. There is not a huge variety, but there are legendary and set items within the game. They do have an influence on build. They are not quite as influential as something like D3, but they certainly will be used to morph your character into having a more, let's say, thought out build. But as I say, it is an issue not having this within the earlier game. My personal preference would be to have weaker forms of these items, so you have some of those Skinner box rewards as you're leveling to make it more exciting. As it stands at the moment, the leveling experience is simply playing through the game at the end of each mission or every 5 missions, just having a quick hover over each item and right-clicking on it if it's green. Obviously there will be some that are meticulously looking for extra crit value because they really like critting, etc. But the game's math system does a large amount of the DPS calculation for you, and really it isn't going to be necessary for the majority. Now, coming back to the actual major issue at hand, the campaign itself finishes after that length of time. You're going to be max level potentially about 5 hours later, maybe even half an hour, depending on your choice of leveling route. And that max level is going to be at 50. You should finish the campaign at about 45. The leveling pace itself actually feels fine. It's about a level every mission, which to me felt like a nice, consistent route. Sometimes it gets a little frustrating in games when the leveling process really drops off at the end, and those last few missions, or last few levels, they turn into 4 or 5 hour slogs. Quite happy that's not the case, so fine, you reach maximum level fairly fast. The gearing process then at the end of the game is equally fast. If you run through, let's say, some fairly standard difficulty boss fights, and you can basically go for a boss rush, which is known as a game mode, but really it's just which boss would you like to fight again. You can fight them, you can get more loot, and even on the normal difficulty at this point, you can still get access to the best quality loot. It's less likely to come, but you still get it fairly often, to the point I'm not even sure the percentages are really working that well. And within a couple of hours, you're probably going to have a full set of your red and shiny gear. Now, certainly, the argument can be made, well, D3 threw items at you at a similar pace, at least in the toward the end of its lifespan. It didn't start off that way, but it ended up that way, and you could certainly argue that's what players will be accustomed to. And you could certainly make the argument that it may take an additional 10 hours to min-max and get everything to the point where it's going to have enough DPS to be completely min-max perfect. But either way, you find yourself having a lack of rewards rather fast. But what's a little bit more disheartening is once you have those items for the majority of builds, not for all, because not all builds are created equal within this game. For the majority of builds, you're going to be steamrolling through even the most difficult of contents. And for me, this is one of the biggest issues right now. Where we had the infinite greater rift system of D3, and I'm not suggesting that an indie studio is going to launch with not only the 7 years of development that went into D3, but also the 7 years after development. That's a lot of development time that went into making it into what it is now. I'm not expecting an indie studio maybe to do that, but the issue with Chaosbane that we have is that the difficulty doesn't match the player strength currently. So basically you can get to the point where all content is easy. And once you reach that point in an ARPG, the game is no longer worth playing for the majority of players. And that is a big issue we have. It seems that that final difficulty, maybe the difficulties as a whole, maybe the character balancing, something needs to be adjusted. So there is a difficulty level that is difficult to do even when you're max gear and max everything. Now we do know there is an extra difficulty level on the way. However, if you are a one character player right now, this means that within 20 hours you will run out of stuff to do. There will be secondary options like leveling up another character of the same type in order to explore the god tree in a different direction. That might be a way to get a little bit more game time out. The God Tree basically represents a passive system, although you can unlock additional actives through it, and it's an extra layer of character development that is perhaps akin to the skill tree of PoE, although obviously far, far smaller. It's simple enough that a beginner player could simply say, well, this way is more damage and this way is more health, so I'll go this way. So it can be nice and simple, but if you're actually starting to plan out where you want to get to and which abilities and why, there is certainly some planning to be done and some thoughts to be had regarding this. But that being said, I do think for each tree you're probably looking at definitely no more than 5 potential outcomes. In most cases I think there'll be an obvious choice, a secondary choice, and that's probably going to be it. Maybe some other janky builds, but obviously we'll find out more about builds people come out with time. But then that comes back to the point of not having a difficulty to really justify being able to do the builds in the first place. So a little bit of a issue here for the game. Now there's a couple more things we need to discuss before we say good day. First up needs to be the price, and the price is obviously going to be a sticking point for some players. This game is pitched at AAA pricing, and although it delivers a very, in my view at least, refined and enjoyable combat, it is over and done with very quickly. And I think there's two prisms and two ways of looking at this, two ways of viewing this game. It's either going to be viewed as a competent but short couch co-op action hack and slash dungeon crawler with ARPG character customization. That's personally how I would define the game. Or it could be viewed as an okay entry-level ARPG that is very short. And unfortunately, that is the situation the game's in, so it does struggle to justify a higher price point. However, that's not to say you can't get pleasure from the game, because clearly there are aspects that the people and players enjoy. There's content on the horizon, although it may be some time before it's implemented. The roadmap is available, so you can check on all this stuff. And I think this, when pitched against other ARPGs, for a player that identifies as an ARPG player, if you're coming from something like Grim Dawn, Path of Exile, if you love those games and you want this to satisfy that part of you, I think I can safely say now it won't. It won't satisfy the build customization because the depth is not the same. It won't satisfy your need to have a long-term investment as a game. This is not a long-term game currently. It may be in the end up, but it definitely isn't now. If you want some short-term fun, this will tick that box, especially if you're after a cooperative experience, although by all means you do not need to be in a party to enjoy this. And nextly, because I've been asked this 100 times, and I know this is a concern for many, there is 2 items for the Magnus edition that include gold bonus and an XP bonus. And of course, that raises a few eyebrows, and I will put my hand down now and say this is not necessarily something I support. Firstly, it is a pay-to-skip mechanic. It is not pay-to-win. I would like to differentiate between the two. It allows you to get somewhere faster. It does not allow you to beat anyone else, because getting somewhere faster doesn't achieve anything extra. But what I would highlight is when a leveling experience is 6 hours, saving 5% of your time is minimal. I know there are some people that are concerned about buying this because they feel that the game will be ruined because of the 5%. Well, instead of leveling in 7 hours, I'm not going to do the maths on the top of my head, it's going to be 6 hours and 45 minutes. Something along the lines of that anyway. But the reality is the result is negligible, and likewise for gold, you do not necessarily need lots of it. You will have enough provided you don't die too much. However, if you don't want to buy it because you simply disagree with the presence of those mechanics, then hey, that is entirely your choice. It's your money. Guys, that is pretty much all we have to say on this game today. It is one that many will be on the fence for. Many will enjoy a good bit of friendly Warhammer Fantasy fun, and others may feel doesn't quite scratch their itch. I'd like to hear down below in the comments what you think of this title, and let me know. Guys, have yourself a great day. You've been listening to Ezic Hydra. Remember to like and subscribe and all of those other things. See you next time.